All right, let's come back together. I know those are some fun questions to talk about. I know that it might be a little bit confusing as we're going through this, but it'll be fun because we're going to be going through a lot of information today, especially from Ezekiel 21. But welcome back again. Last time we were here, we went through Ezekiel chapter 20. And remember, chapter 20 was essentially an overview of how Israel approached God. You guys remember that? Israel was approaching God, and God was saying, you ought not to approach me on your terms and conditions. You have to approach me on his terms. And when we saw through Ezekiel chapter 20, he retells the story of Israel's past. Right, and remember, it was primarily going through the time in the wilderness, the time in Egypt, then the time in the wilderness, and then when they get into the promised land. And remember how every single time that Israel was in either of those, anywhere really, where God placed them, there was always rebellion, right? And do you guys remember what God's response was? He was always saying, all right, it's time for me to just wipe you guys out. Right? But he didn't do that, remember? And every single time God showed, and the important aspect of chapter 20 that we see is that we see God to be a patient, and here's the word gracious God. And so the whole part is just getting at this idea that God has been patient and he has been gracious with his nation. Yes, there is judgment, and yes, there is wrath against this nation, but when you guys recall Israel's history, do you guys see a God of wrath, or do you see a God of grace? Right? A lot of it, God's grace abounds more and more as you read through the Old Testament. And so that really was what shined through in Israel's history. And so keep that in mind, because we need to remind ourselves of that, because as we go through this chapter, that really is the foundation of this text. Right, this grace that we see here. Right, we are taking a deep dive today into now God's judgment. Right, God's judgment and wrath. Right, as he was angry towards those the Israelites in Egypt, and as he was angry towards those Israelites in the wilderness, and as he was angry toward those Israelites who were in the land, God is now angry toward those Israelites in Ezekiel's time. And so, as a reminder, when was Ezekiel prophesying around? At this time, 591 BC. And they are about 5 years out from total annihilation. 586 is when they get destroyed, right, completely by the Babylonians. So keep that in mind. Ezekiel is prophesying during a time in which Israel is on the verge of complete annihilation, being exiled into the nation of Babylon. Ezekiel is prophesying again in the land of actually not Israel or Judah, but in Babylon. Remember, how many deportations are there to Babylon? There's 3. One in 606 or 605 BC. And a pretty known prophet that you guys might know that was exiled into Babylon at that time. It goes by the name of Daniel. 597 BC is the second deportation into Babylon, and that is when Ezekiel gets deported, and the last one is when Jerusalem gets completely destroyed, and that is in 586 BC. So Ezekiel is prophesying about the coming judgment that is coming to Judah